It's a pleasure to be here today. I know there's a lot going on. I'm going to talk about the oil, gas, and energy outlook, and I want to start with the good news. And the good news is the economic backdrop, especially domestically, is very strong. GDP in the U.S. in the most recent quarter was an absolute blowout, 4.9%. That is very strong growth. And if we look at the expectations based on the currently available data, Q4 looks like it's going to be 2.1%. These are really good numbers, and it doesn't look like the hard landing many had anticipated. In fact, it doesn't look like a landing of any kind. Part of the reason growth has been so strong is because jobs numbers are good. And this is the big secret, because 2/3 to 70% of US GDP is driven by consumption, people buying stuff, people paying for services. And we've got right now more people on payrolls in the history of the United States right now. 156.9 million people have jobs. That's why GDP is strong. And that's why even though interest rates are high, the economy's been pushing along. It's why home prices in many markets, I know not here in Central Texas, but in many markets in the US, they're up year on year. It's because people with jobs who are making more money than they've ever made want somewhere to live. And rental vacancies in the United States are the lowest they've been prior to COVID since 1985. So there's not much to rent. We're not building new stuff. Everyone has a job. Everyone has money. And that's been supporting housing. The labor force, which I know many folks have said, well, where did people go during COVID, right? It seems like it's tough to hire folks. And it is. The labor force was at a peak level, new record, in September. It's down just a little bit in October, but it was at a record high in the prior release. And it's up a lot since COVID. Parts of the labor force, though, have lower participation rates. Ages 55 and up and ages 65 and up are much lower than they were before COVID. That's because people retired, and we see a demographic shift. But as we think about a labor force of 168 million people almost, how many people really are there available? I know the unemployment rate logs in at 3.9%. You can see it on the left. It's gone up a little bit lately. And payrolls have gone down in how much they're increasing. But the payrolls are still positive. And even though the unemployment rate's gone up, it's still really low. Now, this is based on survey data. Payrolls come from surveying companies like yours, and the unemployment rate comes from surveying households. But another way to think about how many people are there that we could hire would be to look at, say, the labor force, 168 million, and then say, well, how many people are collecting unemployment? 168 million labor force, 1.8 million are currently collecting unemployment. That's it. Around 1.1% of the entire labor force is currently collecting unemployment. The record all-time low set back in 1969, so it was May of 1969. These are pre-Woodstock levels. That was at about 1 million. But the labor force has more than doubled in size since then. So on a labor force adjusted basis, we're looking at record low levels of people collecting unemployment right now. So your businesses, many others are struggling to hire people. And labor has a significant edge because it's a tight market. When it's a tight labor market, you see labor pushing. This is what we saw with the auto workers strike. The other reason that the labor market, though, feels tight isn't just that there's only 1% of the labor force collecting unemployment. It's that there's about 9.6 million open jobs right now in the United States. This is a lot, and it's about 2.6 million more open jobs than there was before COVID. And if we look across industries, there's a lot. And by the way, not just thinking about before COVID, let's look back. In these graphs, the gray shaded areas represent recession. You see the COVID recession on the right, but you see in the middle, that's the Great Recession, 07 to 09. Before that happened, there were about 4.5 million open jobs. Today, there's 9.6. We have more than double the number of open jobs we had than before the Great Recession. That's why the economy's been able to handle the higher interest rate. And if we look across industries, jobs are plentiful everywhere. Mining and logging, under which oil and gas comes, 35,000 open jobs. Last year, there were 29,000. So even though there's been higher interest rates, there's even more open jobs in that category now. Construction, last year, about 470,000 open jobs. Now, 431,000, even though interest rates have gone really high, knocking on almost 8% recently, and construction still has 431,000 open jobs. So this is good for the economy. That's the big backdrop. And in Texas, the unemployment rate's 4.1%, just a little above the national average, but it's also really strong. And while inflation's been a concern, for good reason, it's also eased significantly. The report out just a couple hours ago showed that total inflation is now 3.2% year on year, and it's 4% for core inflation. This is not near the Fed's target. The Fed's target at the bottom of the graph is 2%. We're not there yet. We don't think we're going to have total CPI at 2% until sometime probably in the middle of next year. Core CPI, which excludes food and energy, is likely to be a bit stickier. The reason? The housing piece. Housing is a third, shelter is a third of core CPI. We don't think that gets back down to the Fed's 2% target until 2025. That means interest rates could be a bit higher for longer, but there's no imminent need for a December Fed rate hike. The Fed may very well be done after the most recent job report showed there were only 150,000 new net jobs added, and because inflation is moving in the right direction. There are risks it gets stuck, but it's getting there. That's the good news. For oil and gas markets, it's not just a domestic story. What's going on internationally, globally matters a lot, and that's where things look weaker. If we look at the IMF's forecast for global growth, the problem here is that advanced economies are expected to slow from 2.6% GDP last year to 1.5% this year and slow further next year to 1.4%. A lot of this is the Eurozone. You look up there, you see a negative number. That's Germany. Germany's expected to have negative growth for the entire year. Some of this is the ripples and the after effects of Cold War II, the higher energy costs, weaker manufacturing. This is where that weakness comes from. But it's not just in advanced economies. Even in emerging markets, GDP last year across that cohort of countries that typically grow much faster than advanced economies was only 4.1%. This year, expected to be 4%, next year 4% again. Those numbers may also be too high, because while high interest rates hurt here, they hurt a lot more in emerging markets where they likely have debt that could be dollar denominated. You have higher interest rates, you have a strong greenback, emerging markets are feeling a crunch. By the way, for emerging markets, 70% of that debt is held by China. Low-income developing countries also expected to slow 5.2% this year to 4% this year, 5.2% last year, 4% this year, expected to be 5.1% next year. I think that's also a little high. Emerging markets are under pressure. One of the areas where we see the data reflecting this weakness globally is in manufacturing. If we look at purchasing manager surveys, these are surveys of people who work in manufacturing and buy stuff. When do they buy stuff? They buy it when they have orders to fill, like goods needed for oil and gas projects. When you buy the goods to finish the product, that finished product ships out the door, that gets added to GDP. When these numbers are above 50, that means expansion. If they're below 50, it means contraction. What you see, you can see a little bit, let's see, there's the laser. This is the COVID recession. Here's the European sovereign debt crisis. Here's the Great Recession here. Coming out of the COVID recession, the US, the blue line, the Europe in green, had this massive spike to record high levels. That led to a significant backlog in manufacturing. If any of you have talked to your manufacturers, maybe some of you manufacture things as well, for the oil patch, you probably have a massive backlog. The companies you buy stuff from probably do too. You need a forklift, you might wait 12 months for one. It's not a rocket, it's a forklift. And you're waiting a year, right? These sorts of things, by the way, if you need one that's electric because you're operating in California, you'll be waiting longer. Like if you need it for 2025, I hope you ordered it before we sat down. For China, they didn't have the big bump coming out of COVID, and it's vacillated around the 50. Right now, the US and the Eurozone are below 50, but they still have a backlog they're burning off. China, though, very weak. As we look at the aggregate of these three series, there's three of them, China, US, Eurozone. Those three economies represent about 2/3 of the global economy. We aggregate those up, 3 of them, break even at 50, 150 is a break even. This is what it looks like now. You can see on the left the Great Recession, the COVID recession, and now. Weaker than during the sovereign debt crisis in Europe, not as weak as during the COVID recession, but still weak. This has had a significant impact across financial markets. It's been weighing all year on copper prices, on aluminum prices, and also on WTI. Despite the fact that OPEC members have curtailed production through the end of next year, and Saudi and Russia have agreed through the end of this year to have additional curtailments, those supply cuts have not been enough because of the pessimism around global growth and how high interest rates are weighing on the global economy. Obviously, the story for NACD is a little bit different. Last year, prices driven absolutely wild by the Russian war on Ukraine and the need for massive dislocations in Europe, imports of LNG. But now we're in a situation where prices have been moving up gradually along with the seasonal roll ahead of the winter strip. Inventories are also up. We're towards the upper end of the 5-year range for natural gas inventories domestically. They're up 8.4% year on year. So NACD's a little bit of a different story. While copper, aluminum, and oil are down on the slower growth, natural gas subject to the winter. And of course, many of you may have seen that article just this week in the Wall Street Journal citing how much additional natural gas we're consuming in Texas, what our electricity demand looks like. This could become volatile very quickly, even if prices right now remain relatively low. One of the biggest things that I think will impact the year ahead is Cold War II. And for many people, they sort of missed this. Back on February 4th of 2022, there was a wedding. And it was not like a happy June wedding, right? It was like a Game of Thrones wedding because it's when China and Russia got married. Maybe you missed it. It's all right. It happened when the Olympics are going on. There was like a whole other thing, and that's when they got married, right? But they didn't elope. They issued a statement that said there's no limit to their cooperation, and they strongly defend the outcomes of the Second World War. Normal thing to say in 1945 or 1946, really weird to say in 2022. Of course, the maps show, right? Russia bigger, China bigger. That's the end game. And Cold War II looks unlikely to end, even though we've got now the most likely scenario in Ukraine where you've got multiple oblasts that have not only been occupied, but Russia has technically annexed. Looks like the most likely outcome here is Koreanification, where you end up with, at some point, a begrudging armistice of sorts, a DMZ, missiles pointed at each other for decades, the rest of the century, something like that. In the last few weeks, we've begun to hear the word stalemate when it's talked about. You're going to probably hear more of it. You have an unstoppable force and an immovable object. The Russians have run down their materiel. About 50% of all their arms, weapons have all been used up in this conflict. But they're pushing for a stalemate. Hold what they've taken. Of course, Cold War II has also now opened a second front. If you haven't seen these graphs, both the one from Ukraine and the ones here on what's called the Daily Iran Report, come from the Institute for the Study of War, a nonpartisan organization that uses GIS data to update what's going on in these conflicts. And this is, make no mistake, this is the Cold War gang getting back together again. You've got the Wagner Group, right? Russian mercenaries supporting Lebanese Hezbollah. You've got Iran funding Hamas, Hezbollah, all kinds of other entities. You've got US bases being attacked all over the Middle East. You've got North Korean arms that were used by Hamas. There's talk of a cyber attack on October 7th. All of these things seem to indicate that this isn't just sort of one country doing one thing, but rather you are seeing the Cold War band back together again. Every day, US bases and troops are being attacked in the Middle East. Every day, rockets are being launched by Hamas into Israel. every day. So this second front is probably going to go on for a while. The biggest risk with this in the oil patch, of course, is if the conflict system expands. You've already got the U.S. being attacked every day around this stuff. What happens if something goes wrong and an attack is a little bit larger than Iran wants it to be, or maybe a little bit smaller, or whatever, and then suddenly you end up with the U.S. fully dragged into a conflict. You end up with Iran more dragged into the conflict. You end up with all kinds of risk here. For oil prices, this presents upside risk, not downside. Even though there's risk to growth, the potential to disrupt supply chains around this, the potential for this to disrupt supply, the potential for additional sanctions to be issued against Iran, that's downside. That's downside for global growth. It's upside for oil prices. But this goes beyond Iran and Russia. There's also great concern about China. This YouGov survey out just this week, Charter published this over the weekend. 80% of Americans currently have a very negative view of China, viewing it as an enemy. And investors that I've been talking to over the last couple of years, the question's been, what about China as a place to invest, right? And it's uninvestable, at least according to the U.S. Commerce Secretary. That's from August. The reason is investors are very concerned what happens if what happened in Russia happens in China. If you happen to have had investments in Russia before Ukraine was invaded, they were worth something. And a few days later, they were not. And the question is, do you end up with a goose egg on your balance sheet? Do you end up with stranded assets in China the way that happened in Russia? And I know that happened to a lot of companies in oil and gas that had to walk away from certain projects. Russia's a much bigger economy. That's a much bigger risk. But wait, there's more. There's also the State Department warning, which raised China from a level 2 to a level 3 country. Just to give you some idea, the State Department has 4 levels of warnings for countries. 4 is do not go, right? That's like Afghanistan now. That's like North Korea. That's do not go. Level 3 is reconsider travel. And you might say, well, what does that mean? Well, that means really like you're a free citizen and can do what you want, but you probably shouldn't go, right? To give you an idea of the wording, what happened here is the Espionage Act changed in China in the month of June. And as a result, the State Department upped its warning level to a level 3. The reason is the risk of arbitrary enforcement of local laws, including in relation to exit bans and the risk of wrongful detentions. U.S. citizens traveling or residing in the PRC may be detained without access to U.S. consular services or information about their alleged crime. U.S. citizens may be subjected to interrogations and detention without fair and transparent treatment under the law. And there's more. U.S. citizens might only become aware of an exit ban when they attempt to depart the country, and there may be no available legal process to contest an exit ban in a court of law. Relatives, including minor children, may become subject to an exit ban. So China's a great place to go if you never want to come back. There's a Cold War II summit today being held in San Francisco. President Xi and President Biden are sitting down. The hope is that what will come out of this is China will assist the U.S. in reducing the fentanyl exports that are going to Mexico that end up as drugs on our street. We'll see what happens. Maybe some of this stuff will come up, maybe not. I wouldn't hope for too much. By the way, the U.S. military is designed to manage conflicts on 2 fronts and 2 theaters of operation. We've got that now. It has not been structured to manage 3 theaters of operation. And so the risk is, what happens if China gets a little bit more aggressive around Taiwan? We can't even pass the bills now related to, as we heard, either the budget stuff, which maybe we get a continuing resolution done, or maybe on Friday night at 11:59 p.m., the government goes into a shutdown. Seems not an unlikely scenario. We've struggled to get aid bills passed for Israel and Ukraine. This makes me concerned that we may also struggle to get other things passed that we will need, and that our government's in a situation that exposes us to those adversaries we have geopolitically. As we think about the energy demand piece, the biggest factor really is the global population's rising. Right now, there's about 8 million people on the planet. I like to think I'm young. I'm youngish. I'm 46. When I was born, there were about half that many people on this planet. When our two presidential candidates were born, most likely candidates, as we just heard, there were 2.5 billion people on this planet. Now there's 8. There's also likely to be another 1.5 billion or so by 2050, on top of the population today. For oil, that means more demand, right? I don't have kids, but I've heard that they don't show up in the delivery room with all the hydrocarbons they're going to need. And that means more demand, period. There's also about 2.5 billion people who live in energy poverty right now, 2.3, 2.4 billion people. That's more demand. We look at some of the demand forecasts. Where is it coming from? These are some OPEC graphs and forecasts from their most recent World Oil Outlook. Transportation is going to be a big one. On-road, aviation, but also petchem and a number of other areas as well, commercial and agriculture. But it's really aviation, on-road, and petchem. That's where we're going to see the most of it. And a lot of it varies by region, right? While in Europe and the United States, there's a big push to get to net zero, reduce our consumption. If we look across regions, right, it's developing countries where you're going to see the marginal demand. It's India, it's OPEC countries, it's China, it's Eurasia. OECD countries are expected to see their demand through 2045 drop. But those emerging markets, where, by the way, that's also where a lot of the population growth is going to happen, right? There's going to be, another 800 million plus people in the least developed countries. That's where you're going to see the most demand for oil going forward. And as we look at the OECD and non-OECD mix, the OECD on the left, you can see the total demand expected to be a little bit lower. What's dropping? Well, a lot of it's coal. That's what's really dropping here. But there are also increases expected in renewables and in NACD. We look at non-OECD, demand goes up, also expected drops in coal, increases in nat gas, nuclear, and other renewables as well. Per capita CO2, if we want to know where we are, say 2022 versus 2045, expected to go down in the OECD, in Eurasia, in China, but India and other non-OECD, that's expected to go up, which really impacts the outlook for renewables. There's a number of different projections out there. The IEF pulled together a report with the Colorado School of Mines looking at all the different forecasts among reputable agencies of what does it look like for renewables going forward? What does it look like for some of the major data around this question? And I'm going to talk about a few different points here. But you can see 2030, the green as a percent for renewables, right? Various percentages. Some of the forecasts by 2050, which is the black lines, they're almost all going up, almost all. And there's even one forecast where they're going to hit renewables at 100%. That sounds fanciful to me. I'll talk about why. But even though that's fanciful, Pew Research recently reflected that 67% of Americans prioritize developing alternative energy like solar and wind, and 69% of Americans favor the U.S. taking steps to be carbon neutral by 2050. So these things make this a relatively bipartisan issue, right? This is the majority of Americans. And if we look at where they want government intervention, what do they want? 66% of Americans said they want to encourage production of wind and solar power. 43% want to encourage use of electric vehicles. Oil and gas drilling, this is the interesting one. 34% of Americans want to encourage it. 30% want to discourage, and the rest are in the middle. Coal mining looks very different. 21% want to encourage it. 39% want to discourage. So there's a few different pieces of this that I think are really, really important. While there is a push for more solar and wind, right? The sun doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, right? But the spending expectations, this from S&P Global Commodity Insights, shows that renewable spending on power and storage by technologies are expected to rise across the board in the years ahead. This is part of where I think companies are going to try to get to their emission mandates and limitations, and 74% of Americans support a U.S. global role on climate change, which is probably why, ready or not, sustainability reporting is coming. We've already heard this alluded to, the SEC open rule about when are you going to have to disclose your Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions if you're a large accelerated filer. The proposal that's out there was for fiscal year 2023. A lot of public companies are very concerned this could still happen, could still be announced this year. For Scope 3 emissions, for large accelerated filers, that would be for next year. There's also a risk management piece around what does climate risk mean for your business. By the way, these things, of course, I'm sure you're all very well aware, have already happened in California. These disclosures, these timelines, different, I mean, not these exact timelines, but a timeline to disclose Scope 1 and Scope 2, and then Scope 3 with varying levels of assurances has already been signed into law by Governor Newsom. That's coming. If you do business in California, over $1 billion business, you will be reporting to California, period, on these issues. But despite that, this is all about reporting. It's not yet about what are the changes their company's going to make. Obviously, renewables is a piece of that, but there are limitations to net zero plans. Last year, the New Climate Institute and Carbon Market Watch looked at what the 25 biggest companies in the world were planning, and 13 of them said they were engaged in offsets with insufficient permanence, nature-based solutions. 13 of the 25 biggest companies in the world, their solution to net zero is planting trees. That's what that means. The other 12 are a mix of no published details, uncertain about offsetting plans, and no neutralization plan. So 13 of the 25 biggest companies planting trees, the other 12 a mix of no idea, no comment. And that's not even the biggest problem. The biggest problem is, while solar and wind work, there's also a question of having additional batteries to supplement it. And in Texas this summer, our grid was held together because we had some additional new battery storage we put in place to help carry us during those periods of peak load. And trust me, as someone who goes to South Africa multiple times a year, you do not want 12 hours a day of load shedding, okay? And I've seen that. It's not great. It's very difficult to maintain business continuity. But the other piece is there's not enough metals to meet net zero emissions. For example, this IMF data shows we're only mining about 60% of the copper we'd require to get to net zero in 2050. We're only mining about 35% of the nickel. We've got 20% of the cobalt and 15% of the graphite. But wait, there's more. For nickel, just the energy transition, this from the Colorado School of Mines, the International Energy Forum, part of their report showed the demand in 2040 for nickel would require 1.3 times the current annual production of the largest producer in the world of nickel, Indonesia. If you're planning to get to net zero with electrification and batteries, and you're going to stop using oil and gas, and you're going to hit the targets everyone said, you're going to need to find a new 1.3 times the biggest producer of nickel. Copper, you'd need 1.8 times the annual production in Chile, the biggest producer of copper. Silver, you'd need 2.3 times the annual production of silver in Mexico, the world's biggest producer. For cobalt, you'd need 2.4 times the annual production in Congo, biggest producer. For lithium, you'd need 12.8 times the annual producer of the biggest country, which is Australia. I don't know if we're going to find 13 new Australias worth of lithium. If we don't, those hopes for batteries are drastically at risk. And that's not even the most risky part. The riskiest part is that some of these critical metals and elements come from China and Russia. This Cold War II thing gets hotter, suddenly those supply chains are wildly exposed. And the exposure isn't just with batteries, there's also risk around solar panels. If you've tried to do a large commercial solar project recently, you may have heard about gray solar panels. What are those? those are panels that come from China, where China will not certify that slaves did not make them. So China's using slave labor for solar panels. If you won't certify you didn't use slave labor, you did, right? So that's a problem. That's going to slow down some major solar projects. And then there's the actual forecasts that we have from the Department of Energy and Energy Information Administration. This is the consumption numbers through 2050, current administration's numbers, this year's forecast. This is liquid fuels demand now, expected to go down through the mid-30s and then go back up. Natural gas demand somehow expected to go down for the next decade and then go back up. This is really surprising to me, given the fact that if you're going to get off coal, you're going to need a lot more natty. And while the administration has hopes for what the future of electric vehicles may look like, the administration's own forecasts from the Department of Energy show that by 2050, only about 18% of new vehicles sold in 2050 are expected to be electric in the reference case. 18% in 2050 are electric. The rest are some mix of normal conventional vehicles or hybrid. So some key takeaways. Big thing is global population growth will drive energy demand up. Global nat gas demand is poised to surge as we see that replacing coal domestically and internationally. There's a lack of a great substitute for liquid energy hydrocarbons. I know y'all are aware more than I could say, right? That fuels really make the economy go, and there's not a great substitute. I know folks talk about hydrogen, still very expensive. It's going to be a long way out. There's all kinds of other logistics questions about that. Battery solutions face physical supply limitations. We've seen that. We don't have enough stuff to mine. I know they're going to be mining more the ocean floor, and we're going to be mining asteroids like in the movie Alien. Like that's what we're going to be doing. But we just have to hope that an asteroid made only of lithium happens to come by as we need it. And then, of course, Cold War II adds complexity to the energy transition. Like, if you also have mandates not to have stuff made by slave labor, that's going to be an issue.
Jason, we're going to have to end it there. I'm so sorry we're so short on time. But
no, all good.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Let's give Jason a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.